If you had ever asked me 2 years ago why I never had time for the things I cared about, I would have answered almost immediately: school. It always seemed like the obvious explanation to me. For context, I was a straight A student. There was always another assignment to finish, another test to prepare for, another reason why drawing, reading, or learning something new had to wait until later. But later never really came. Hello, I'm Lynn, and today I'd like to walk you through an experiment that quietly changed the way I think about attention. On the surface, it's the story of how I quit TikTok, although somewhere along the way I realized I was actually trying to understand something completely different. Looking back, the strange part is that I genuinely believed I was too busy. I believed my schedule was the problem. I believed school was something that was consuming every available moment I had. And maybe partially it was. But there was another part of the story I wasn't willing to acknowledge yet. Whenever I had a few minutes to myself, I reached for my phone. It appeared during moments so small that I never thought to question them. Moments like waiting for the water to boil, waiting for an ad to finish, taking a break between assignments, or eating lunch. Those small moments that once belonged to my own thoughts slowly became filled with an endless stream of short videos. And at first, it felt completely harmless. Everyone around me was doing the same thing, no? It didn't seem dangerous at all. Even though now, in the year of 2026, we all have felt its negative impact. Back then, it was just entertainment, just a few minutes here and there, just something to relax. But slowly, without really noticing, those minutes started becoming the default answer to every moment of boredom I had. And that was the first thing that eventually made me question it. Not the amount of time itself, but the automatic nature of it. Because I wasn't really choosing TikTok anymore, I was simply going there without even sparing it a thought. The moment I truly noticed something was wrong happened somewhere near the end of November 2023. I was standing beside my desk, taking what I told myself was just a short break. TikTok was open as usual, and my mother, she called my name from another room because she needed help. And without even thinking, I almost answered, "I'm busy." But then I stopped because I wasn't busy at all. Come on. On the contrary, nothing I was doing actually mattered enough to keep someone waiting. And that moment really stayed with me. I made an uncomfortable realization. I lied to myself before I ever lied to anyone else. And for years, I kept saying, I don't have enough time. Yet somehow I always found the time to scroll. The contradiction bothered me. What's more, I saw myself as someone disciplined, as a disciplined person, someone responsible, someone who had control over her time, but my actions were quietly telling a whole nother story. I knew something had to change. And instead of immediately trying to fix it, I decided to do something much simpler. First and foremost, I decided to measure the time. I didn't delete TikTok, I didn't make some dramatic promise that I would never use it again. And chasing some perfect dopamine detox was also out of the question. I simply wanted an honest answer to this query. How much time am I actually spending here? So, I accessed Android's app timer. The answer appeared on my screen, and it was 4 hours. I looked at it again. 4 hours? Honestly, it hurt. Although those 4 hours didn't make me a bad person, they shattered the illusion of who I thought I was. I told myself I was disciplined. I always told myself I was responsible and that I had control over my time. But 4 hours every single day on TikTok didn't look like control to me. Even more, it looked like time quietly disappearing while I convinced myself it wasn't. Ironic, isn't it? That evening, I also started calculating. 4 hours today, 28 hours this week. More than 56 full days every single year? That's almost 2 months. And to think sometimes even more. The number itself wasn't what affected me most, though. I understood what those hours represented. Time, actually, is never just a metric of duration. It is an emotional currency we spend, borrow, and lose. That time may be represented through a painting that never gets finished, 30 pages of a book that remain unread, a project that stays inside our heads instead of becoming something real. It's a skill that I personally have never had the chance to acquire. Then and there, I stopped measuring TikTok in minutes. I started measuring it in opportunities, and that changed the question completely. I didn't ask, how do I stop using TikTok anymore? But I asked, what am I actually trading away every time I open this app? What could exist in its place? I must reclaim the small pieces of my day that had slowly stopped belonging to me. But knowing the problem obviously didn't solve it. If awareness alone fixed habits, nobody would struggle with them. So I began treating the next few months as an experiment. The first thing I tried was pretty simple. I moved TikTok. I buried the app several pages deep into my phone, somewhere I would not naturally reach whenever I unlocked my device. And for a few days it actually worked. There was a tiny moment of satisfaction, of course, and almost like I had outsmarted the system. I had created enough distance between the impulse and the action that I finally had a second to notice what was happening. But then, my thumb adapted faster than I did, and it learned a new route. The movement changed, but the intention behind it remained the same. So I moved it again, and again, and again. I began noticing a pattern, a sequence, a familiar path that my brain had repeated hundreds of times. And interestingly enough, I was not consciously sitting down and deciding I want to open TikTok now. That action was already halfway completed before I had even questioned it. And such a phenomenon is defined by automaticity, a term referring to the neurological process by which a deliberate action becomes an unconscious habit. In my case, it was opening TikTok, or rather pressing on that exact location where the app was usually positioned. This happens when control of an activity shifts from the conscious part of the brain to the deep automatic processing centers, and I understood that I was not simply fighting a lack of discipline there. I was trying to overcome a deeply rooted behavior using only motivation. And motivation, as we all know, it is a fragile tool. It has a habit of disappearing exactly when we need it most. So I started trying to understand myself by setting a boundary, a different kind of experiment. I opened my phone settings and set a time limit for TikTok, 1 hour and 5 minutes. I wanted proof that I could actually keep a small promise to myself, so I lived with that timer for weeks. To be precise, the timer itself wasn't changing my behavior. The moment it interrupted, the habit was. Though I must confess, every time I reached the limit, I craved more. It was almost painful. It felt as if I were a child and a grown-up would snatch the phone away from my hands, leaving me crying and craving more. Therefore, every time I saw the warning that TikTok will close in 1 minute, I left the app instantly. Why? Because I wanted to make it my decision, that I solely was the one in charge, not the app timer. Of course, I did not keep my word every single time. Still, this action compounded, and after exiting the app on my own accord, I felt way more inclined to actually do something other than stare at the ceiling in pure agony and self-resentment. I really do not remember how many days I kept my app timer at 1 hour and 5 minutes, maybe 3 weeks or 4. Definitely not too much, as I felt comfortable enough to reduce the time even more. Consequently, I reduced it to 45 minutes, and then to 5 minutes. I became most curious about what would happen if I were to minimize the TikTok time to such a short amount. To my surprise, it wasn't nearly as unbearable as imagined. Having only 5 minutes on the app wasn't the strange part. It was realizing how precious that tiny sliver of time became to me. Before, 30 random minutes disappeared without me noticing. Whereas now, I began bargaining with myself. Is this really how I want to spend today's 5 minutes? I wasn't consuming automatically anymore. I wasn't deciding deliberately. Something had fundamentally changed. The timer was no longer forcing me to stop. It was helping me pause, think, reflect, and only then take the next action. I began treating my attention as a precious resource worth allocating, rather than something to spend without thinking. I even saved those 5 minutes. Sometimes I would keep them for the evening. Sometimes I'd use them only if I wanted to look up something specific or show a friend a particular video. The app was still on my phone, but it no longer felt entitled to my attention. It was indeed a freeing transition. But it left another question. If TikTok was no longer occupying those hours, what would? I didn't want to replace one addiction with another, and I wanted something that left evidence behind. At times like that, I didn't let myself get kidnapped by the hustle culture. I didn't replace such an app with another way of constantly being productive. I decided to use that extra time to genuinely rest, relax, and enjoy things without feeling like every moment had to be optimized. I picked up painting again, or more precisely, painting by number. Looking back, it was probably the spot-on replacement, because painting, by number specifically, removed almost everything that had stopped me from creating in the first place. I didn't have to wonder what to paint, what to sketch, and I didn't have to worry about whether I was talented enough either. The canvas already existed, the colors were waiting, all I had to do was begin. That mattered way more than I realized at the time. We often assume that changing our lives requires extraordinary discipline, and I don't think it's always the case. Sometimes it simply requires reducing the uncertainty or the friction of taking the first step. Painting by numbers asks almost nothing of me. Just paint this section, then the other, and then another. 10 minutes became 20, and 20 became an hour. Sometimes I listened to music, I watched playthroughs in the background. I still needed stimulation, of course. I was nowhere near cured, and still I felt more grounded than before. I don't think that's something we acknowledge enough. Progress rarely arrives all at once. It overlaps with the old version of ourselves for quite a while. TikTok wasn't replaced with perfection, I was replacing it with something that left evidence behind. Every evening, the painting looked slightly different than it had the day before, and frankly enough, the change was almost imperceptible to others, but still beautiful to me. I would stare at a painting that was resting against my wardrobe and felt proud, excited to add more color, to see how it would transform next. I loved the feeling. I had something I could actually hold in my hands, something I could touch. That was something TikTok had never been able to give me. And after 4 hours of scrolling, nothing remained. After 4 hours of painting, though, there was a canvas. It wasn't just about art anymore, it was about me leaving something behind, something for me to recall and look back upon in a few years. To recall the process, the emotions, the excitement that none of the social media apps would have ever provided. This was a massive success at the time. Success that had taken over other activities which I eventually decided to slowly but surely encode into my day. With journaling, with learning, and building systems as well. And finally, the hardest thing for me to implement, reading. Basically, with every hobby I slowly returned to. They all left something behind, either knowledge, either skills, objects, and some simply left memories that felt genuinely lived instead of endlessly consumed, and that was more than enough. What's more, something else happened that I didn't notice until much later. The paintings, for example, stayed, not just physically. They stayed as little reminders of who I had been while painting them. Even today, every painting has a year attached to it. I like documenting them, as every one of them reminds me of a completely different period of my life. I remember how my room looked, where I placed the canvas, the podcasts I was listening to then, sometimes the weather, sometimes even the conversations or emotions I had completely forgotten. And those emotions resurfaced the moment I glimpsed at the painting again. It's truly fascinating how an object can quietly preserve a certain version of ourselves. And when I look at one of those paintings today, I don't just see the paint. I remember the person who painted it, the person who wasn't painting to become an artist, but painted to collect evidence. Evidence that I could stay with something, that I could return after a difficult week instead of abandoning it. That missing a few days didn't mean I had failed. It simply meant I continued later. And that became one of the most valuable lessons I have learned. Progress isn't destroyed because it pauses. It continues the moment we decide to return. Looking at the numbers makes me smile. In 2024, I finished 2 paintings. In 2025, another 2, and probably my most difficult ones, alongside a puzzle and a bead embroidery project. This year, I've already finished another painting, and one more is halfway complete. You can say painting my number has become my new addiction pretty much, but a healthy addiction. If someone else looked at that over 3 years, they might think, only 8 paintings? I see something completely different though. I see hundreds of small decisions, 10 minutes here, half an hour there, a quiet Sunday afternoon, a difficult school week where I barely painted at all, and then coming back, that's the part I'm most proud of. I learned that stopping doesn't have to mean quitting, and that realization quietly spread into other parts of my life, into reading, journaling, building systems, and learning. None of those habits became perfect, but they became consistent enough to become part of who I am today. And looking back, I think that's where my identity really began to change. Every time I returned to a painting, every time I picked up the book again after leaving it untouched for days, every time I wrote another page instead of giving up because I'd missed the day before, I was quietly collecting evidence. Evidence against the person I believed I was. And eventually, there was simply too much evidence to ignore. I no longer had to convince myself that I was becoming someone who could stay with difficult things. I could look around my room and the proof was already there. On the 20th of April 2024, I officially deleted TikTok. I simply pressed the deletion button as for any app that I no longer needed, that no longer served me. In fact, I reinstalled it once in 2025 out of curiosity. Conversely, instead of getting addicted again, my head started to ache. The app felt strange, overwhelming, foreign even. Definitely not something I wanted to have in my life. Such a phenomenon may be owed to the theory, that TikTok wasn't part of my identity anymore. It wasn't part of what I was building, just like a stranger that I was emotionally unattached to. The app was deleted the very same day. Looking back now, I don't think quitting TikTok changed my life in the way I once imagined it would. There was no sudden transformation, no morning where I woke up as a completely different person. I was still the same. I still had moments where I reached for my phone without thinking. I still procrastinated. I still had difficult days where concentrating felt almost impossible. And to be frank, I think that is something important to acknowledge. For a long time, I believed change was supposed to feel like a clear separation between the old version of myself and the new one. Almost like one decision would divide my life into 2 parts, before and after. But that was not how it happened. The change was much quieter. It appeared in small moments where I reacted differently than I would have before. A day where I felt tired, but still painted for 10 minutes. A moment where I wanted to abandon a book, but decided to read a few more pages. A time where I missed a habit for a week, yet returned instead of assuming I had failed. And those moments may seem insignificant individually. However, when I look back at them together, they form something much larger. They form evidence that I was capable of returning, that I could build something slowly. and that my previous assumptions about myself were not permanent truths. And perhaps that was another valuable thing this journey taught me. Through such small experiments, I began constructing a different story. Not through positive thinking, not through convincing myself that I was suddenly a disciplined person either. Through proof. Proof like paintings hanging in my room, a few finished books on my shelf, pages filled with thoughts I once permitted to overwhelm my poor mind, and small creations that existed because I had decided to spend my time differently. And that changed the way I viewed identity, especially since for a long time I believed that identity came before action. I thought I needed to become a disciplined person first. Then I would naturally read more, create more, or learn more. However, my experience showed me something different. Identity is often built in reverse. We become someone through the evidence we repeatedly create. And this is where I think the story stops being about TikTok. The app was simply the medium through which the problem was revealed. But the deeper question was always, what kind of person am I becoming through the way I spend my attention, through the way I spend my time? Every day, we are answering that question, even when we don't consciously think about it. The hours we give to something are not just hours disappearing. They're small votes, small pieces of evidence, contributions towards a future version of ourselves. Contributions, bad or good. And that idea can feel intimidating at first. It took me about 3 years to really implement visible changes into my life. And someone might hear the story and think, 3 years? I don't have 3 years to change. And I understand that feeling. Looking back at my own paintings, my own books, habits, I sometimes wonder, what would my life look like if I had started even earlier? What if I had begun 3 years before? What if I had given even 15 minutes a day to something I cared about? That thought is a little painful. There is a strange sadness in realizing what could have existed. But alas, time is a precious resource that no one can get back, and therefore let's focus on what's to come. And I think there is another way to look at it. The next 3 years will pass regardless. Time will continue moving forward whether we use it intentionally or not. So instead of only asking, what would my life look like if I started 3 years ago? Perhaps we can also ask, what would my life look like 3 years from now if I begin today? And today, by the time I'm writing the script, it is the 16th of July 2026. 3 years from now, I will be older either way. I will reach that point regardless. I will reach the point of 16th of July 2029 regardless. The question is, what version of myself will arrive there? Will I arrive with another 3 years of wandering? Or will I arrive there with 3 years of experience, of trial and error, of slowly but surely improved systems? 3 years of just ideas versus 3 years of things I created, learned, and explored. For me, maybe that means creating videos and building a community around ideas I care about. For someone else, it might mean learning a new instrument, writing, drawing, studying, building something that changes their lives, slowly but surely, once again, one step at a time. The activity itself matters less than the relationship you build with it. And here I want to be frank with you. The activity itself matters less than the sustainable relationship you build with it. Over time, something you force yourself to do every single day becomes a principle you can't live on without. And I have observed this through countless systems I slowly built. And here I want us to pay more attention. Grandiosity is the enemy of durability. Start small and build big, just like I and many others did. Ask yourself, what do you want to become part of your identity? What is something you have quietly wanted to begin but kept postponing? Keep in mind, the future version of yourself will not manifest from a single dramatic decision. It will be constructed from small actions that you repeat long enough to become evidence. And here I invite you to run your own experiment. After this video, exit YouTube, access your settings, then app activities, and here, let's start with TikTok or any app of your choosing. Look at the screen time, the average value of your week, and reduce it by 40 minutes, for example. It may seem like nothing, but a start is a start. Then, decide upon an activity you wish to engage with, to which you decide to dedicate 15 minutes of your day, and write it down and or comment it under this video. Remember, it doesn't have to be set in stone. As long as it replaces the mindless scrolling or helps subdue it, it will work just fine. To help with the withdrawal, instead of accessing another social media app, open your music app, Spotify for example, and listen to some music while doing that said activity. It will be hard the first week, I understand you, but don't let it discourage you one bit. Just think, by the time September arrives, what will have changed? Who might I become if I protect even a small part of my attention? The smallest actions are the ones that begin the longest of journeys. I think direction matters much more than speed. If you decide to run your own experiment, I genuinely love to hear what you discover.